lucky. I'm Adrián Lerner. I teach Latin American history here, and we're very lucky to have with us Paulo Drinot, who is a professor of Latin American history at the Institute of the Americas at UCL. Paulo is one of the most dynamic scholars of Peru and Latin American history working today, and a very generous colleague, if I may say so. He has published monographs on the intertwined histories of labor and race in Peru, on the history of prostitution in Peru, on historiography, and he has edited volumes, often in collaboration with some other leading scholars of Latin American studies, on the travels of Che Guevara, on the history of comics and memory in Latin America, on the Great Depression with his Oxford supervisor Alan Knight, on Peru's military government of the 60s, 70s, on Peruvian's global studies, studies in dialogue with social theory, on Leguía, and some synthetic work on Peruvian history, and forthcoming volume on APRA, I believe. And he's also published articles on a range of topics. He's been the lead editor of the Journal of Latin American Studies until a few years ago. And today, Paulo will talk about a portion of his current work in progress, funded by a major Leverhulme grant, which is on the life and times of the great Peruvian Marxist thinker and icon, José Carlos Mariátegui, on which he has published already some articles and a small book on his disability and on the global aspects of Mariátegui. And today we will hear about Mariátegui as an interpreter and observer of Europe. So, welcome, Paulo.
Thank you, Adrián. Thank you to all of you for being here tonight, and to CLAS for the invitation. Okay, so I'll just start. Although widely recognized as the most important Marxist intellectual in 20th century Latin America, Mariátegui remains little known outside of the region. His contributions to Marxist thought, avant-garde cultural production through the magazine Amauta, established in 1926, and to the politics of the left. Mariátegui founded the Peruvian Socialist, later Communist Party in 1928, remain largely unacknowledged in global treatments of these topics written in and from the global north. In recent years, his ideas have gained traction in some quarters as a consequence of attempts to reclaim his thought as part of a wider decolonial canon, together with Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, and others. But these rereadings, much like earlier readings, have tended to focus somewhat narrowly on some aspects of Mariátegui's vast intellectual production, particularly his most famous writings, the Siete Ensayos de Interpretación de la Realidad Peruana, and on his materialist and now supposedly decolonial interpretation of Peruvian history. So in this paper, I want to draw attention to a little acknowledged dimension of Mariátegui's intellectual work, his interpretation of 1920s Europe. José Carlos Mariátegui spent 3.5 years in Europe, from October 1919 to March 1923. This experience was transformative at a personal and a political level. In Italy, where he spent most of his time, he met his wife, Anna Chiappe, and became a Marxist. He famously noted that he returned from Europe, quote, un marxista convicto y confeso. And most famously, he attended the Livorno Congress in 1921, where the Italian Communist Party was created from the split with the PSE. Although his biographers and other scholars have paid some attention to Mariátegui's time in Europe, I aim to explore in greater depth how he interpreted the Europe he experienced. And so here I'm going to present just some preliminary ideas. Between 1920 and his death in 1930, Mariátegui wrote several hundred articles on European politics and culture and its major figures. He covered the rise of fascism in Italy and the creation of the Italian Communist Party, as I've already mentioned, as well as how expressionism and dada were changing European art. He wrote about Mussolini, Poincaré, Trotsky, Keynes, but also about Pirandello, Grosz, Shaw, and Freud. He discussed the Versailles Treaty, the 1926 general strike in Britain, and Trotsky's deportation from the Soviet Union in 1929, as well as European feminism, colonialism, and antisemitism. So in this paper, I argue that Mariátegui produced one of the most complete and compelling accounts of Europe in the 1920s, an account that European historians, but also most scholars of Mariátegui, have all but ignored. In fact, it is interesting to note that in the book titled José Carlos Mariátegui y Europa, published in 1993, which contains the texts that were presented in a symposium held in the French cities of Pau and Tarbes, none of the texts, with the exception of Bernard Lavalle's on Mariátegui's and French literature, focuses actually on Europe as an object of reflection for Mariátegui. So I'm going to focus on Mariátegui's writings compiled in two collections, Cartas de Italia and Figuras y Aspectos de la Vida Mundial. And these are part of the collection of the Obras Completas, the complete works of Mariátegui that were published from the 1960s onwards by Mariátegui's sons, from his family. Cartas de Italia compiles articles published in the newspaper El Tiempo, and he wrote these articles between 1920 and 1922 while he was in Italy. And you can see here, this is his credencial as a journalist of El Tiempo. Most of these articles were written in Rome, but a few were written in other Italian cities such as Genoa, Florence, and in the Frascati. Figuras y Aspectos de la Vida Mundial was the title of the regular column Mariátegui wrote for the weekly Variedades between the mid-1920s and his death. You can see Variedades there. But it also compiles articles he published in Mundial. These were the two major kind of bi-weekly journals or magazines in Peru in the 1920s. So, while the articles published or compiled in Cartas de Italia were written in Europe, those that were compiled in Figuras y Aspectos were all written in Lima. As I developed this project, I plan to take into account also Mariátegui's writings in other compilations, including Historia de la Crisis Mundial, which compiles the lectures that he gave in Lima at the Universidades Populares González Prada shortly after he returned from Europe. The articles that were compiled in La Escena Contemporánea, which was Mariátegui's first book, published in 1925, which includes famously his writings on Italian fascism, which are brought together under a section called Biologia del Fascismo. And then, of course, his writings on Europe included in both Amauta and Labor. Labor was a companion journal to Amauta aimed at a more working class audience. So I have identified 320 articles. The vast majority are on Europe, though some touch on the US and a few on Asia. And as can be seen from this slide, I'm very proud of the fact that I was able to make these things. As a historian, we're not renowned for Excel skills. So anyway, just over half were published in Variedades, 52%, 1/3 in Mundial, and 1/5 in El Tiempo. Mundial is slightly overrepresented because the articles that he published there came in a section called Lo que el cable no dice, what the telegram doesn't tell us. And these were usually 3 short articles grouped together, so they make up more than they really were. And I've grouped these articles in 2 broad categories, culture and politics, and you can see politics here. It represents about 3/4 of the articles. These are obviously very broad and somewhat arbitrary categories, but I'll get into that in a minute. So, examples of these articles include the article on the formation of the Poincaré cabinet, published in Variedades on the 31st of July 1926, but also an article on Tolstoy's centenary, published in Variedades on the 15th of September 1928. It's also interesting to see Mariátegui's output per year. As is clear from this graph, it was uneven across the 1920s, with most of the articles concentrated in the last 2 years. Again, this is skewed somewhat by the fact that he started publishing the articles in the column Lo que el Cablo no dice Mundial, and I've counted these shorter pieces as separate articles. But it's still, what's important is that he was productive throughout the 1920s. So the articles published between 1920 and 1922 were all published in El Tiempo. His first contribution to Variedades is from September 1923, and those in Mundial start in 1924. He published an article roughly every 2 weeks in Variedades between September 1922 and April 1924, but he did not publish again until September that year, and this was of course because of the major health crisis he experienced in May of that year, which led to the amputation of his right leg. As his correspondence confirms, Mariátegui complained regularly that ill health affected his ability to write. And yet, even as his health worsened considerably towards the end of his life, he continued to churn out article after article, in addition, of course, to all his other editorial activities and his political and union organizing. Mariátegui's output on Europe became a source of criticism. Even after his death, Magda Portal, the APRA leader and poet, wrote an article in APRA, which was the party's periodical, in which she contrasted the physically limited Mariátegui, I quote, forced by his disability to look at life from an armchair, end of quote, and therefore unable to carry out political work, to a vigorous and dynamic Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre, the leader of APRA. The APRA leader, according to Portal, had travelled all around Peru, living with the Indian, and had gone, I quote, into the pores of his homeland to extract that truth which is now the banner of his struggle, end of quote. While Mariátegui, again, Portal says, quote, continued to rehearse topics on European affairs. Portal concludes, José Carlos of Peru only knew Lima. And this is the great difference. While Mariátegui, because of his physical tragedy and his special inclination, dreamed and wrote, Aya acted. History will tell which of the two built on firmer ground, end of quote. Now, Mariátegui had famously addressed the claim that he was an europeizante, or Europhile, in the introduction to the Siete Ensayos published in 1928. I quote at length. All this work is but a contribution to socialist criticism of the problems and history of Peru. There are many who think that I am tied to European culture and alien to the facts and issues of my country. Let my book defend me against this cheap and biased assumption. I have served my best apprenticeship in Europe, and I believe that the only salvation for Indo-America lies in European and Western science and thought. Sarmiento, who is still one of the creators of Argentinidad, at one time turned his eyes towards Europe. He found no better way to be an Argentine, end of quote. I maybe should have given a trigger warning for decolonial readers of Mariátegui just here, but sorry I didn't. And already in 1926, in the introduction to Amalta, Mariátegui had made clear that the focus on building socialism in Peru could not be separated from considering the broader contemporary, global contemporary scene. So he says, the purpose of this magazine is to raise, clarify and learn about Peruvian problems from doctrinal and scientific points of view, but we always consider Peru within the panorama of the world. This magazine will link the new men of Peru, first with those of other countries of America, and then with those of other countries of the world, end of quote. So, returning to Mariátegui's writings in Europe, as this graph shows, although Mariátegui wrote about the politics and culture of most European countries, we can clearly see three groups. So the first group consists of Italy, France, and what I've called here international, where I'm grouping a whole series of articles that cover more than one country or that directly address kind of transnational topics, such as the League of Nations and things like that. Okay? So clearly those took up most of his time. Then there's a second group, where one could include Spain, Germany, the Soviet Union, and perhaps the United Kingdom. Mariátegui devotes between 10 and 30 articles to each of these countries. And you can see, on Italy there are almost 70, right? And then the third group consists of countries that are only explored in a handful of articles and include Austria, Romania, Ireland, Poland, Bulgaria, Greece, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Switzerland, and Yugoslavia. Now, of course, Mariátegui's writings on Europe have attracted attention from scholars, in particular his writings on Italian fascism, originally collated in his book La Escena Contemporanea, as I said earlier, and memorably titled Biología del Fascismo, have been explored in numerous publications. And my colleague Martín Vergel has written on Mariátegui's work on the Russian Revolution, which he sees as key to the development of Mariátegui's cosmopolitan socialism, a concept that Vergel has introduced into Mariátegui's studies, which I think is very helpful. Nevertheless, Mariátegui's broader writings on Europe remain poorly known and underappreciated. It is striking, for example, that while Harry Vanden and Bart Becker's English language anthology on Mariátegui includes a handful of texts that reflect Mariátegui's writings on Europe, so there's an article on Gorky, there's an article on surrealism, an article on art, decadence and revolution, an article on Gletkov's novel Cement, they're all grouped in a section called Aesthetics. At the same time, there's a separate section called Latin America, which does compile a series of articles that Mariátegui wrote on Latin America. But Mariátegui only wrote about 50 articles in all on Latin America, which were later compiled in this book, Temas de Nuestra América. But 50 articles is only about a sixth of the 300 plus articles that he wrote on Europe, and yet there is no section on Europe. Nobody's really written about Mariátegui's writings on Europe with that level of attention. So, this is really my main thesis here. The fact that Mariátegui devoted a considerable amount of time to writing about Europe has not been sufficiently recognized or appreciated. As I noted earlier, I've grouped the articles into two very broad categories, politics and culture. But other ways to organize these writings tell us something about how Mariátegui approached his articles on Europe. Most were of a reactive nature, reactions to events as they happened. And this is particularly true of his earlier writings in El Tiempo, which can be read as a chronicle of political events as they unfolded in Italy between 1920 and 1922. You can see here a photograph of Mariátegui from his time writing in El Tiempo. And this is also true of his later writings, such as those in Mundial, which are short reflective pieces that are intended to provide additional insight to the news of the day, hence the title of the column, Lo que el cable no dice, what the telegram is not telling you or us. Other pieces are more contemplative, not reactions to events, but rather reflections on processes or historical developments. An interesting example is the article La Casa de Ciegos de Guerra, which he wrote in the Frascati in June 1921, about a home for soldiers blinded during the First World War. And this becomes a kind of broader reflection on the horrors of war and the contrast between what he sees as the soldiers' predicament and the beauty of the Frascati countryside. Now, perhaps aware that much of his writing tended to focus on the larger European countries, Italy, France, Germany in particular, and those he was most familiar with because he had spent some time there, Mariátegui also undertook what was clearly an attempt at a survey of the rest of Europe. Beginning in May 1925, Mariátegui wrote a series of articles with essentially the same title: La escena húngara, la escena checoslovaca, la escena yugoslava, la escena rumana, la escena polaca, la escena portuguesa, la escena suiza, and so forth. These articles represent a kind of systematic survey of these lesser European countries, a clear attempt to provide a comprehensive perspective on European politics beyond the big powers. In addition to this systematic survey of politics in the smaller states, Mariátegui also examined inter- or transnational themes pertaining to Europe. Several articles deal with the League of Nations and more generally with the post-war settlement, including the question of German reparations and the politics of disarmament. Other transnational issues he surveyed included the conflicts in the Balkans, tensions between Italy and Yugoslavia, and various anti-colonial conflicts, particularly in Morocco. Later in the decade, he turned his attention to questions such as the impact of the Wall Street crash on European economies and the debates over rearmament, as well as the growing tensions between Russia and China. Now, these articles tended to be reactive, but again, there were more reflective pieces which tended to focus on cultural themes such as Freudism and literature, developments in the art world such as post-impressionism, dada and cubism, or Stefan Zweig's writings on Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, even Isadora Duncan's memoirs. So I focused so far on the breadth of Mariátegui's analysis of European politics and culture, and now I'm going to turn to look in a little bit more detail at some of these pieces. So take the article published in Variedades on the 8th of May 1926 on the general strike in Britain. This is the typescript of that article, and this is the article itself. For Mariátegui, what was at stake in the 1926 general strike was not merely an industrial dispute in the mining sector in Britain, but rather the very course of history. I quote, "The real contenders are not the bosses and the workers of the British mines. They are the liberal conception and the socialist conception of the state. The forces of socialism stand face to face with the forces of capitalism." End of quote. Mariátegui argued that the only solution to the dispute was the nationalization of the mines, but the British state rejected the solution because it was seen as a socialist solution. The response of the bourgeois state had been to grant concessions, what Mariátegui termed interventionism, and he says, which is nothing more than the theorization of the fatal retreat of the liberal idea in the face of the collectivist idea. Mariátegui concluded by hedging his bets. No hagamos predicciones, let's not make predictions. But he seemed clear about which way the wind was blowing. And I quote, "The English have an inexhaustible aptitude for transaction, but this time the best transactions would be, for the capitalist regime, a tremendous defeat. Only the crude and clear imposition of its views could stem the proletarian tide." End of quote. So, as is well known, the British mining industry was nationalized after the Second World War. The proletarian tide that Mariátegui identified was contained in the 1920s, the miners were defeated, and the industry began a process of gradual but inexorable decline. It took the Great Depression and its near mortal blow to capitalism, the threat of fascist global domination and the rise of the Soviet Union to the status of a superpower for Western European countries like the UK to undertake a major restructuring of its capitalism that involved state ownership of key economic sectors, but also the expansion of social welfare. Now, Mariátegui could not have foreseen any of this, and his non-prediction was clearly wide of the mark. There was no proletarian tide. But his article on the British general strike was not mere reportage. It did not stop at telling his readers about the strike, its causes, or its protagonist. Mariátegui attempted to interpret the general strike through the lens of historical materialism and class struggle. And as I hope to show as this project develops, his analysis of the British general strike was part of a broader attempt to apply this approach to historical change in a systematic manner to the Europe of the 1920s, much as he did more famously to Peru. So to develop this idea, let me turn now to one of the articles on the series of minor countries. The article La Escena Húngara, the Hungarian scene, published in May 1925, is interesting for several reasons. Again, in this article, we see that what Mariátegui is trying to do is not simply to report on the government of Miklós Horthy, the former admiral of the Austro-Hungarian Empire who assumed power after the communist government of Bela Kun was overthrown in 1921, Bela Kun there, pushing aside the King of Hungary. What Mariátegui is trying to do is interpret the Horthy government, there's Horthy with a friend of his, from the perspective of a broader analysis of the course of post-war European history and politics. It's worth mentioning that Mariátegui begins his analysis by pointing out that the Hungarian case is little covered by the Kabyle telegram. undoubtedly an important source on which he depended to write his articles once he was back in Lima. And he explains that his analysis draws on Francesco Nitti's text, The Decadence of Europe. Nitti is a member of the Italian Radical Party and a key figure in Italian politics during the first half of the 20th century. He was prime minister between 1919 and 1920 and would become one of the major figures in the kind of anti-Mussolini resistance after Mussolini's rise to power in 1922. Now, like other declinist texts written after the Treaty of Versailles, The Decadence of Europe was highly critical of the conditions imposed by the Allies on the Entente. Now, here I want to pause just briefly to note something. Nitti includes an article in this book which reproduces the racist narratives about the occupation of the Rhine by French colonial troops. The Schwarze Schmach, sorry, I don't speak German, the Black Disgrace, was the term used by German propagandists and others in various countries to criticize the use of African soldiers, French African soldiers, in the occupation of the Rhine. They were accused of rape and a number of other crimes. And Nitti reproduces these accusations at length, which is full of racism. So I quote one bit: orchestras of blacks and African barbarians play in the squares of the occupied cities, and programs of African music are given frequently. The inhabitants of the country, which with Italy has given the greatest musical geniuses to the world, from Mozart to Beethoven, from Bach to Wagner, have the advantage of being able to hear the almost barbaric music. In Wiesbaden, in this very summer, bands of African Negroes regaled Germans and foreigners with African melodies. End of quote. I find it interesting that Mariátegui draws a lot on Nitti in his analysis, but never mentions the racism that is very evident in this text. Instead, he presents Nitti as a statesman. Now, Mariátegui notes the problem created by the Treaty of Trianon, signed on June 4, 1920, which, he says, mutilated Hungarian territory in favor of Romania, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. Hungary, he notes, has lost 63% of its territory. By solving the problem of minorities living in the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the treaty has created new minorities, this time Hungarian, in the territory ceded to the neighbouring countries. As a result, Mariátegui agrees with Nitti, a nationalist powder keg has been created. I quote, Hungary is among the defeated countries the one with the deepest national spirit. End of quote. The Hungarian problem, he adds, appears as one of those that most sensibly threaten the peace of Europe. So, as we know, more than Hungary, it was the German-speaking territories in the Sudetenland that most directly led to the Second World War, or were used as an excuse by Hitler. But Mariátegui is not wrong when he writes, I quote, the history of the Great War teaches, moreover, that any of the very intricate conflicts in this area of Europe can be the spark of a European conflagration. End quote. Another noteworthy dimension of the article is that Mariátegui interprets the seizure of power by the regent, Miklos Horthy, of fascist affiliation, as an effect of the reaction of the European conservative class, as he calls it, to the communist experiment of Bela Kun. That is, he sees Horthy as an expression of the interests of the political and economic powers that have triumphed in the war, and presents these interests not as national, but as class-based and ideological. This, in a way, is an extension of the critique of how the post-war order has been established without thinking about the medium to long-term effects. But it is also a reflection of how Mariátegui, without leaving aside the national and nationalist dimensions of the Hungarian scene, interprets the European post-war context through a materialist and internationalist lens focused on class interests that transcend the national interests of each country. Mariátegui, moreover, tries to offer an original interpretation of the figure of Horthy. Quote, Horthy has no similarity with the other men of government who emerged from the post-war crisis. He is not a dramatic condottiero of reaction like Benito Mussolini. He is neither a born statesman like Sebastian Beneš. He's actually referring to Edward Beneš of the Czech Republic. In a way, he sees Horthy as a figure of the old regime who benefited from the circumstances. I quote, He is a naval officer and an official of the Austro-Hungarian regime, whom the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire and the fall of Belarus Republic have placed at the head of government. The chance of a historical time has put him where he is. But in trying to typify Horthy, Mariátegui resorts to the figure of the caudillo. Quote, for some features of his personality, he is strangely related to the Spanish-American caudillos. For other traits, he is close to the kind of Asian despots. In any case, he is a Balkan ruler rather than a Western ruler. Whether Hungary is really in the Balkans is another matter. But anyway, that's how he frames it. So this last idea deserves attention. At the beginning of the article, Mariátegui writes, quote, it seems that in separating from Austria, Hungary has also separated from the West. And it's interesting to think about Mariátegui's conception of Europe and of the West, which appear here as a synonym, and which emerges from these comments. In another part of the article, he writes, Horthy's government inspires its policy in the interests of agrarian property. His actions show an unconscious tendency to reconstruct in Hungary a medieval economy. Under Horthy's regency, the countryside dominates the city. The industry, the city, languish. So we see here clearly Mariátegui's interpretation of the processes he is describing, an interpretation clearly derived from his reading of Marx and historical materialism, but also inflected by declinist narratives of the interwar period. It is the fact that Hungary is reverting to an agrarian feudal economy which makes it move away from Europe and which makes its leader resemble a Spanish-American caudillo or an Asian despot. It is an interpretation derived from Mariátegui's association between Europe and the West, capitalism and the modern, and on the other hand, the non-West, the pre-capitalist world and the pre-modern world. It's also interesting that Mariátegui adds a personal note to his text, recalling that he had visited Budapest 3 years ago, so in 1922. I quote, I found there a misery comparable only to that of Vienna. The industrial proletariat earned a starvation ration. The urban petty bourgeoisie, pauperized, was rapidly becoming proletarianized. César Falcón and I, his companion, wandering through the suburbs of Budapest, discovered an intellectual, author of 2 books on musical aesthetics, reduced to the status of a doorman in a tenement house. The journalist told us there were people who could only have 3 or 4 meals a week. End of quote. Now this anecdote tells us something of Mariátegui's method in writing his columns, and perhaps explains why his analysis was so engaging. Mariátegui combined the cable, the news, his readings, such as Nietzsche's book, and his personal experience of Europe. It was his ability to interweave these 3 types of sources that allowed him to produce sophisticated and compelling, if not always accurate, interpretations of the European situation. Although, as we have seen, most of the texts he published after his return on Europe focused on Europe, after his return to Peru focused on Europe, it's important to emphasize that Mariátegui also sought to think of Europe from a perspective that we might call today global. I've already mentioned that Mariátegui devoted several articles to the colonial question, both in Africa and Asia, and the theme of European imperialism and anti-colonial movements is very present in texts published in Variedades and Mundial. The article published in Variedades in March 1929, 25 años de sucesos extranjeros, 25 years of foreign events, deserves particular attention. The article was included in a special issue of the magazine marking its 25th anniversary and published alongside several articles on national events. Mariátegui's article offered a panorama of world history in the quarter century since Variedades had begun to be published. In the article, he begins by comparing the last 25 years with the period between 1789 and 1814, marked by the French Revolution, the Napoleonic era, and Spanish-American independence, which he argues is the one that lends itself best to comparison with the years since 1904. For Mariátegui, like the last quarter century, like the era of revolutions of the late 18th century, had also been marked by the stormy advent of a new order. However, while the process that began with the French Revolution had mainly impacted Europe and the Americas, the present one encompassed the whole world. Its stage, he concludes, has been the 5 continents. Indeed, what is remarkable about the article is that while it highlights the importance of the First World War, the Russian Revolution, the Spartacist Revolution in Germany, the rise of fascism, it devotes an equal amount of space to extra-European processes that he sees as clearly shaped by developments in Europe. The Chinese Revolution of 1911, what he calls the Hindu nationalist movement, and to a lesser extent, the Mexican Revolution. And it is particularly interesting in the sense that his analysis begins with the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, an episode, together with what he calls the process of westernization in China and the autonomous movements in India and Egypt, which he presents as evidence of the awakening of the peoples of Asia and Africa. We see again a historical materialist approach in how he explains the defeat of Russia in the war with Japan, emphasizing the fact that the Asian country had developed a superior form of capitalism than the Russian Empire, although he recognizes the role of British imperialism in encouraging the nascent Japanese imperialism. But Mariátegui does not seek simple explanations for the processes he interprets. In his analysis of the First World War, for example, although he recognizes as key factors the growing rivalries between the European powers, and particularly the growing German threat to the hegemony of Great Britain due to its rapid industrial and economic progress, he also emphasizes the fact that the conflict was the product of factors that could not be explained solely with reference to Germany's hegemonic ambitions. Thus, he quotes Lloyd George, who, quote, agrees that the more prudent thesis is that the war came about not by the premeditated and exclusive will of any one party, but by a series of unthinking acts, all or nearly all the belligerents, which made the armed conflict finally inevitable. End of quote. So I'm not going to dwell here on Mariátegui's analysis of each of the historical processes he describes in the article, but I do want to focus on the kind of global dimensions of his analysis. And it's interesting there that he stresses the role of contact with the West, i.e. with Europe, in both China and India, as creating the conditions for economic, social, and even political and cultural change. I quote, "The Europeans entered China in a brutal and rapacious mood of depredation and conquest, but the invasion of the Western powers brought to China not only their machine guns and their merchants, but also their machines, their technology, and the other instruments of their civilization. Industrialism penetrated China under their influence. The Chinese economy and mentality began to change, and at the same time, thousands of Chinese left their previously closed and country to study in European and American universities, acquiring their ideas, concerns, and emotions that took hold of their intelligence and psychology for a long time." End of quote. For Mariátegui, these processes explain the nationalist revolution in progress. I quote again, "The revolution appears thus as a work of adaptation of Chinese politics to a new economy and a new conscience. The old institutions did not correspond for a long time to the new methods of production and the new forms of coexistence. China is already quite populated with factories, banks, machines, with things and ideas that do not agree with a patriarchally primitive regime." End of quote. In the case of India, Mariátegui similarly detects a positive influence coming from Europe, highlighting the emergence within the Indian National Congress of a revolutionary current of socialist inspiration emancipated from the influence of Gandhi. Quote, "The program of this current, directed from Europe by a nuclei of students and Indian emigrants, proposed a complete separation of India from the British Empire, the abolition of feudal ownership of land, the suppression of indirect taxes, the nationalization of mines, railroads, telegraphs, and other public services, the intervention of the state in the management of large industries, a modern legislation of labor, etc." Mariátegui interprets these changes as evidence of growing class struggle. The two great factions, he says, showed a class-based contempt and physiognomy. The revolutionary tendency was supported by the proletariat, which was harshly exploited, had no access to protective laws, and suffered the most from English domination. The poor, the humble, were faithful to Gandhi and his revolution. The industrial proletariat was organised in trade unions in Bombay and other industrial cities. The right-wing tendencies, on the other hand, represented the rich castes, the Parsis, the merchants, the landowners. End of quote. Again, we see here how Mariátegui does not stop at reporting on developments in China or India. This is not mere reportage. Mariátegui employs the same analytical lenses of historical materialism and class struggle that he employs in his more famous analysis of Peruvian reality. But here, the analysis is not limited to a national case, but rather encompasses global processes of European capitalist and imperialist expansion, as well as the nationalist and anti-colonial struggles that they engender in the colonial and neo-colonial sphere. By way of conclusion, there is no doubt that Mariátegui developed a reading of Europe in the 1920s of the utmost importance. We see an attempt not only to report on events, but to interpret them from a Marxist perspective, using the same analytical frameworks he would employ in the Peruvian case. It was also a reading of Europe that embraced a global dimension as well. It was also a reading of Europe that embraced a global dimension as well as an internationalist one. Mariátegui, in short, was not only the brilliant author of the 7 essays of interpretation of Peruvian reality, he was also the brilliant author of more than 300 essays on the interpretation of European reality. Thank you.